Unicorn Overlord is very much its own beast, but it feels stuck heavily between its inspirations of Quest's Ogre Battle series and Fire Emblem. The gameplay is undeniably in the vein of Ogre Battle, specifically the Nintendo 64 classic Person of Lordly Caliber. To prepare for writing this review, I had hoped to give this game a full shot, but Nintendo 64 is about the last retro system I wish to own, so I settled for watching some gameplay online and put this neat-looking game snugly in my backlog, right next to Tactics Ogre Reborn and the original Ogre Battle. Oh boy. Yeah, that's a hell of a way to start.
Unicorn Overlord.
Hello everyone, my name is Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman, and if you enjoy what I do, my coverage of Unicorn Overlord, strategy RPGs, or more meta discussion stuff like today's video, then a like on the video and a subscription to the channel would be very much appreciated. Thank you so much. So what is the topic of the day today? Well, as you probably saw from the thumbnail and the title, we are discussing the Unicorn Overlord review published yesterday at the time of recording on RPG Site, penned by one Cullen Black. I don't normally do meta commentary. I definitely don't typically discuss other people's articles or reviews, especially in a critical manner, but I feel the need to today because RPG Site gave Unicorn Overlord a 7 out of 10, which on its face is fine. They can not like the game, it can not resonate with them, they're allowed to give it whatever review score that they want. However, this review is built off of a lot of misunderstandings, misrepresentations, and outright incorrect information about the game, and I wanted to put something out that could speak to that and correct it, because frankly, I'm kind of disappointed here. And before I go any further, listen, I don't know Cullen, I don't have any sort of professional relationship with RPG Site, anything like that. However, I was following RPG Site's coverage of Unicorn Overlord leading up to its release, quite closely as a matter of fact. Some of my own coverage was guided by things that they posted, and so those of you who were here during the pre-release period probably remember me referencing back to RPG Site, directing traffic to the site, telling people check out their information, their reporting, because that's where I got it from, that's the source. And I encourage that you do that here as well, because as much as I am critical of this review, I have no personal issues with RPG Site. I have no personal issues with Cullen, its author, and I want them to get the traffic that they deserve for putting the effort into this review, and I want you all to draw your own conclusions. We'll be focusing primarily on things that are just factually incorrect or misrepresented in the review. There'll be a couple of personal opinion things that I will be addressing as well, but the bulk of this is going to be very objectively right or wrong type of information stuff. And I also want to give a quick preface for some context about Cullen's apparent background. He says that he is very much a casual enjoyer of strategy RPGs. He doesn't particularly enjoy real-time strategy games, and when he plays things like Fire Emblem, he tends to play on the lower difficulties. Nothing wrong with that, but I do think it does lend a bit of context to what Cullen is saying here, why he's saying what he is, and I feel like it's important to keep in mind for anyone who is listening along to what he has to say here. In particular, this does go a long way in explaining his initial statement near the top of the review that I prefaced the video with, where he talks about how he has not played an Ogre Battle game, whether it be Lordly Caliber or the original Ogre Battle, and he's not even played anything like Tactics Ogre, which is another game that Unicorn Overlord draws a lot of clear inspiration from. The entire Ogre series is very clear inspiration for Unicorn Overlord. I would assume that he probably has also not played Symphony of War, the Nephilim Saga, the recent indie title by Dancing Dragon Studios that draws very clear inspiration from Ogre Battle's combat style, even if its map gameplay design is much more based in Fire Emblem. So there's not as much of a background to draw on here when discussing Unicorn Overlord, which I think calls some of his later comments into question. He goes on to say that the storytelling feels far more Fire Emblem up to the quality of antagonists and the formula and rhythm of how the plot plays out. Between these 2 points of inspiration is the occasional original idea that has potential but is ultimately drowned out by a game that cannot help but suffocate in its attempt to be a nostalgic callback. And again, this is one of the opinion things that I did feel I wanted to just comment on, because A, I've played every Fire Emblem game in existence, and especially compared to some recent titles like Fire Emblem Engage, Unicorn Overlord's story and villain design and writing in general is leagues above that of Engage. Realistically, in the recent pantheon of titles, I would say only Three Houses has comparable writing. Things like Engage or Fates, even though I love Fates, not exactly the same level of writing in my personal opinion. And to say that Unicorn Overlord is a game that is drowned out by its attempts to be a nostalgic callback, as someone who hasn't even played the Ogre Battle games or Tactics Ogre, things that it's clearly referencing, and in my opinion referencing quite well, that already begins to raise some red flags for me. The second bit of personal opinion that I take issue with is centered around difficulty. And this one is really, really baffling to me. For the sake of this review, the game was played on Tactical, as described the second highest available from the get-go on launch. Originally, the review was planned to be played on Normal, but due to the changes made to difficulties with the Day 1 patch, Tactical was the chosen difficulty mode. At first, it seems this was well received, with Cullen praising the gameplay loop as being strong, exploration, helping those in need, building off of one another, there being some stressful gameplay early on, how he had fun assembling his formations, and that there was a lot of strategy involved there, that after the opening continent of Cornea, the difficulty apparently fell right off. Later on in the review, he laments that Expert is the only difficulty mode that actually has a limit on items until you unlock True Zenoiran, which does cause a lot of tactical decision making, something I agree with, because you can't just rely on items to power through any given difficult situation. And I'm glad that he points this out, because it is a very valuable aspect of what makes Expert difficult beyond just increased unit stats and other sorts of tweaks made to normal gameplay elements. What's staggering to me is that at multiple points throughout this review, and it's something that he talks about directly, which we'll talk about in a moment, Cullen describes that Tactical doesn't require you to pay attention to team composition. Tactical isn't hard enough, even for someone who is a self-described casual player of strategy RPGs. And yet, even though the game allows you to change the difficulty at any given point, something that Cullen himself pointed out, he never did. So the question I raise is, if you started on a mode that you thought would be the appropriate difficulty level for you, you found that once you had a grasp on the systems, you were having an easier time than you expected, and the game allows you to increase the difficulty whenever you want, why not just increase the difficulty? And especially if you are doing a review of the game and you're feeling bored with the current difficulty, why not crank things up and see if you enjoy it more, rather than cranking it up going, oh yeah, that feels better, and then turning it back down to see how the game plays out on Tactical. He literally says, the game lets you switch at any moment. Every time I did so, I felt myself enjoying the game much more, but I still found myself on Tactical for a majority of my playthrough because I wanted to see if the mode would pick up. But why? And then why let that personal decision color your review of the game when discussing its difficulty? Like, if a difficulty mode isn't for you, that's not the fault of the game when it's offering you different options that you literally say you enjoy more. Like, that just baffles me. And it's frustrating to see that be a negative mark, and such a big negative mark, on a game that does actually offer a fairly challenging tactical landscape. And I think there is something to be said and a discussion to be had for the overall difficulty of the game. Hardened veterans of the strategy RPG genre like myself find it to be a fairly easier difficulty, but even so, we're on the far end of the spectrum. For the casual player, Expert is going to provide plenty of challenge, so if you're worried about that, if you want a challenging experience, you have to actually engage with that more challenging experience, right? Maybe that's just me, but that was probably the most baffling aspect of this review for me. Moving on to more mechanical discussion, something that I did want to call out right off the bat is that the review refers to stamina as action points, and that is some point that I wanted to clarify, as they are two different systems that exist within the game. Stamina is what is being referred to here, that number that when it is reduced to 0 by repeated combat, a squad can no longer move until they rest. That is stamina. Action points are your action economy resource, along with your passive points that you use to utilize active abilities in combat. Not a huge deal, it's an easy mistake to make, but I wanted to correct that because, again, if someone's reading this review and hasn't played Unicorn Overlord yet, they might get an inaccurate picture of how the game actually functions and get confused. So I wanted to address that as we go through here. It was also said that every class has a unique leader skill, which is not correct. Every class has a leader skill, but there is overlap between various different classes. Every flying unit, for example, has flying as their leader effect. There are also other classes that have the greater garrison skill that allows them to regenerate HP and stamina faster when they're garrisoned, things like that. There's not a ton of overlap, but there is overlap. Not every class has its own unique leader skill. Perhaps the most baffling mechanical misrepresentation or misunderstanding or what have you in this review, though, is the implication that beyond a single promotion option, there's essentially no class progression in the game, and that just doesn't make any sense to me. The review says, this would be less of a problem if class progression was flexible, which almost sounds perfect for a game as customizable with team composition. Unfortunately, it's linear, and that linearity is a straight line with 2 points on it, which, okay, fair, I love branching promotions as much as the next guy. It would have been really cool to see. The sticking point, though, is this. If you're even a little bit thorough with side content, you can unlock class progression pretty early into your game, and then not feel like your characters will meaningfully improve for the rest of your playthrough. Which just, again, is incorrect. There are two major facets of class progression beyond just your promotion, and which typically take place after promotion. First of all, once you promote, you get a suite of new abilities that you'll unlock as you continue to level up that will oftentimes dramatically change the playstyle of a given class and unlock a lot of new team synergies for your unit building, which actually, really, there's 3 different progression options now I think about it. We'll get to that. The second is as you continue to find new pieces of gear that give you brand new tactical options to complement the skill set that a class naturally has. So you can actually find new synergies outside of the naturally learned skills of a class to make them even stronger and make them fit a role even better. Finally, there's the fact that as you progress the size of your actual units, you'll be able to get different synergies and combinations online between classes, especially, again, once they level up, get more skills, and you get access to new items. None of that is mentioned here. And, while it's discussed, well, there's the tactic system, and you can customize that, and it is fun to be able to put your different units together, the way that plays with actual class progression is not addressed at all. And I think that's a huge miss here, because unlike something like, say, Fire Emblem, where you have one character with a class, maybe a couple classes you can switch between, and they level up and you can get different forms of progression for them individually, this is not an individual character combat-based system. It's a squad-based system. So you need to look at how any given character or class is going to interact in a given unit or squad before you say definitively, oh, this class or this character has reached their max potential. They are not going to grow anymore. You're going to be growing until you finish the game, because there's always going to be new skills or new items to find unless you grind insanely early on. He follows on from this by describing some complaints about the stamina system and how you only wind up having any sort of penalties when you actually rest a unit. If they just run down to 0 stamina, you just can't move them. And that's something that a lot of us have actually praised, because it makes the tactical decision of when do you actually rest your unit when they'll be safe, or when do you just leave them there able to defend themselves but not able to move until you are able to rest them. And for Cullen, that was apparently something that should have had some sort of a debuff or a reduction of stats, but the question is why? What is the point of that when the developers clearly have a state for a unit to be in where they do have that debuff when you choose to rest them so that you can get back to using them? The system is already set up the way that developers intended it to be. Why would they add an extra debuff on top of that? Then move on to more personal opinion type things, issues with lack of mission variety and things like that, which I can see, but the issue that I take, and that a lot of people tend to take who are veterans of the strategy RPG genre, is when a game just evolves into every single map being a gimmick. And that's something that has happened to Fire Emblem a lot in recent years, where it's almost hard to see the just raw strategic gameplay when every single map has a different wacky objective or mechanic going on that you suddenly need to work around. You can't just use your units, figure out what's working statistically, what items and weapons you need, that type of thing. So to me, having an experience that's a little bit more down to earth, still has some varied mission objectives, but largely it's less about what it is that you need to do and more about how you need to do it that I find interesting, that I think a lot of other people find interesting. But again, that's more of just a personal opinion thing. And then we get into the story critiques, and this is where I start to question. Obviously, we're playing the same game, but it really feels like, was the story being paid attention to here? The first big critique is the idea of where's the resistance from the Empire? And this is something that I've seen discussed a fair bit because, yeah, the Empire really isn't that involved. And if you're worried about story spoilers or anything from here on, I'll have a timestamp that you can jump to where we're not talking about story anymore, both in the description and on screen now. So, we all thought that the Empire would be more involved in the day-to-day combat, attacking towns, pushing back against territory, things like that. But that's not the nature of the story, and that's very intentional. By the time of the actual main bulk of the story, the Empire has won, and they're working towards their objectives. What are those objectives? Shattering the seals and bringing forth the Zenoiran souls from the abyss. They don't need to actually fight anymore. They got access to all the territory that they needed access to and the associated shrines in each country so that they could shatter their seals and open the gates. That's all done. The only thing they have left to do is focusing on their primary summoning rituals in Grand Kareen, in the capital of Cornea, and that's what they're doing. They don't care what territory you take back because they already got what they wanted from it. They don't care about holding territory, claiming resources, disrupting or securing supply lines, making sure that they have access to a strong supply of citizenry for various tasks. They don't need any of that because they're pulling souls out of hell and stuffing them into people's bodies. Like, that's the goal, and they've already basically achieved it. The last seal is broken when you first rescue Scarlet at the end of the first chapter of the game, and from then on, they don't care about anything else going on out in the world. So it makes perfect sense. As you go through the game, it's almost eerie. It's like, yeah, we're fighting the standing forces of Zenoira that are scattered across the world holding territory, but it's largely all just people that were just told to stay there, and they're just holding their territory, and they don't really know why. They're good, obedient soldiers who are just fighting the good fight while their masters are off doing whatever it is that they're doing. And you do start to get that sense that this is too easy. Something should be happening here, and then once you get to the end of the story and you find out what Galerius is up to, what Baltro is up to, what their plan is, it all clicks into place. So this is a very strange critique to me from someone who apparently did finish the game, and it makes me wonder how much attention was actually paid to the story as it is. And I feel like the answer must be not much, because it's repeatedly stated that the story is bland, uninspired, doesn't go to places that it needs to, is not fulfilling in the way that it was expected. And it's like, I just didn't get that feeling at all. And it makes me think that just the appropriate level of care was not provided here. Another aspect of the review that makes me think that even more is discussion of when Scarlet gets kidnapped at the beginning of the game. Cullen states that there is an implied time limit that is not actually utilized in terms of needing to rescue Scarlet, as if you can just go and rescue her whenever you want and everything will play out is exactly as you would expect. But I know from experience that that's not true. There are bad ends of the game where you don't rescue Scarlet, where she gets possessed, she becomes an important part of the enemy's war machine, and that can happen if you go to certain places or do certain things without rescuing her. That time limit is there. It's not a real timer, like you have 8 in-game hours to play before she winds up getting possessed or whatever, but that is absolutely something that can happen, and again, not mentioned in this review. Finally, we come to the whole brainwashing concept, and it's very funny because that is a very simple story mechanic that a lot of people critiqued very early on, but those critiques died away as people played more of the game, because you learn quite quickly that brainwashing is not actually what's at play here. It's what the characters assumed was at play here, but then you actually find out it's much more than that. We're actually in a situation of full bodily possession with complete personality erasure until someone is freed from that effect. So yes, concerns that villains would not be given trial for the atrocities that they commit, things that Cullen talks about in his review, sure, that is something that we were concerned about early on, but once you learn what was actually happening, you find out these people are totally not to blame. You know, even more so than if they had just been mind controlled, they were literally being puppeted around. They were the ultimate victims in many, many ways. And yet, Cullen says this concept is dropped early on, which doesn't... No, It's rife through the whole story. You're encountering characters who have been possessed, or characters who are doing the possession, talking about the various different aspects of this spell, how it can be countered through the entire story, right up to the very end of the game. In fact, it's one of the most important plot points and one of the biggest reveals of the end of the game when you fight Galerius. So it's like, it's not dropped. What are you talking about? It just feels like there is a certain lack of care that was given to paying attention and analyzing the story based off of early beats that were disinteresting or seemed basic. And that caused all of the important twists, the subversions of expectations, to be missed. And I feel like that's a shame. Again, this is a big knock against the game alongside its perceived issues with difficulty that contribute to the score that it was given. And I think that's extremely unfair. And I don't think that this is an appropriately involved aspect of the review. Finally, this culminates in the summary sections at the end here. I'm just going to read this verbatim. Quote, "That's what's so underwhelming to me. Outside of the art direction, nothing in this game excels past being just good enough. There's nothing in this game that feels truly awful, but it rarely manages to achieve excellence. This wouldn't be a problem usually because I have no qualms with games that are just fine. It's a game I wanted to love, and one I see why so many others love, but just couldn't find that love for myself. It lets me down so much because these ideas and systems feel like they have so much potential. This features the most in-depth customization I've ever seen in this genre, but I think the freedom on offer leads to an unbalanced final product. So often I felt threatened with more than a good time, told to get excited for cool things to come soon, but it didn't deliver that. This review might seem negative, but that's because what this game does best isn't unique to itself or terribly interesting. The successful elements are all skin deep. The game's Unicorn Overlord was inspired by it, didn't have a template to follow, so they took risks to see how they could leave their own marks. Unicorn Overlord seems allergic to risk-taking, and it makes for a safe and enjoyable product that fails to introduce anything new, so when I was given just a passable game, I couldn't help but be let down." Here is my biggest issue with this statement, and it is twofold. First, throughout the review, numerous different aspects of the game are heavily praised. The art direction, the voice acting, the character writing, the tactical depth, the interesting possibilities for unit building, etc., etc. And yet in this summary, only the art direction is given the appreciation that it deserves. For so many things that were described as stellar, they are then dismissed in the end paragraph as being just good enough. And it overall paints this picture of a very conflicted review. And what's baffling is the idea that Unicorn Overlord doesn't do anything unique or interesting, that it is not taking any risks, that it's playing it safe. But I ask, what's taking it safe about reviving a genre of RPG that hasn't been seen since the Nintendo 64 by a developer that has never made a game like this before and strove to make one of the biggest, most impressive entries in the genre in decades? What is skin deep about that? What is safe about that? The two major examples of other strategy RPGs that Unicorn Overlord were compared to in the beginning of the review were Fire Emblem and a Triangle Strategy, and they both absolutely have huge merits of their own. Even Fire Emblem Engage, which I have heavy criticisms of, I still think was a very good game, and I highly recommend to people. Triangle Strategy is one of my favorite games of recent memory. I think it is a phenomenal entry and a great homage to Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre Reborn, or just Tactics Ogre in general, really, because Tor came out after Triangle Strategy, but I digress. Compared to those games, Unicorn Overlord is striking out in a wildly different direction. From its squad-based combat, to its pseudo-open world, to its real-time strategy gameplay, and taking elements of these other successful strategy RPGs and weaving them into something completely new. That is anything but skin deep. It is anything but risk-averse, and I truly don't understand how this conclusion could be the one that was arrived at. There's so many questionable things that were said in this review, to say nothing about the just outright incorrect information provided, that I really did feel the need to talk about it. And I don't think that giving this game a 7 is in any way fair. Because remember, In most gaming culture nowadays, when it comes to reviews by major outlets, a 7 is about as low as it gets. Unless we're talking about a truly god-awful Gollum tier experience, 7 is about as low as it goes. You go from 7 to 10, and that's it. So giving one of the most ambitious and I would argue successful strategy RPGs in recent memory a 7 is frankly, to me, insulting. Additionally, I'm concerned that something so ambitious and that had so much love poured into it, and that so many people, fortunately, are viewing as their Game of the Year candidate that is sold so well, it's still such a rare beast, a unicorn, if you'll pardon the expression, that I'm afraid that any sort of negativity towards it will cause us to not get anything else like it in the future, especially with critiques that are so poorly grounded. I want to see more games like this. I don't want every strategy RPG made to be an FFT clone or a Fire Emblem clone. I want people to do different things, and I want them to feel that they have the safety to experiment, to try and to do more and different and unique. And yeah, maybe things that are inspired by games that are 25, 30 years old, but if they haven't been around in the lifespan of many of the people who are going to be reading or writing these reviews, I think it's fair to say that they're taking some risks and breaking some new ground. I don't know about you. So, again, I don't have any personal issues with RPG Site or Cullen, but I was very perturbed by this review, and I wanted to get my thoughts out there about why it is that I am so perturbed about it. Apologies if this was a little rambly, a little bit uncoordinated. I will do my best to make sure that it is a concise and enjoyable experience for your listening pleasure. I've never really done a video like this before, so if you have any thoughts or comments about my commentary or this review itself, do please leave them in the comments down below. I would love to see that discussion. And I know I have been very critical here, but again, I don't do it out of a sense of malice. I do it out of a sense of love for these games, for this genre, and out of a desire to push back against what I see as very unfair criticism, because this is a gentle, burgeoning flame, and it needs to be carried forward with intent, not smothered with very harsh criticism. With all that said, though, my name has been Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there. And remember, be good to each other. Bye now.